Good morning, Vice-Marshal Gale, Ian Gale. It's very good to have you with us.
Morning, Craig.
Good morning. I'm Craig Marsh, head of the College of Business at the University of Lincoln, and perhaps I could just ask you to introduce yourself briefly for our...
For sure, yes. My name's Ian Gale, and I'm the Assistant Chief of the Air Staff in charge of strategy, political relations, and I suppose in this context, some organisational change initiatives.
Fantastic, Ian. Thank you. So for 20 minutes or so, our main subject of conversation is leading organisational cultural change. So perhaps I could just kick us off by just inviting you, in your view, Ian, what you believe to be like your kind of working definition of organisational culture, and why that should be an important topic for leaders to consider.
Sure, and it's a really difficult one. I'm glad you said my opinion, because there are many opinions on the topic. And of course, the literature takes you through so many different views of it. But for me, it's a combination. I'm going to say a few words, and it's a combination of all of these. This is the cloud that I tend to draw from. So it's the way things are done around here. And that is, most importantly, when people aren't looking. Although it involves when people are looking as well, it's when people aren't looking. It's how we deal with each other. What behaviours are acceptable, who gets rewarded for what sort of things, the written and unwritten rules, and our values. And so I suppose if I sum that cloud up, I think it's an organisation's personality and its character. Really hard to measure, and it needs to start with that working definition. And I think it's vital, because if you don't understand that organisational culture, how do you know what's going to work? Because if you go, if Steve Jobs had been born 50 years earlier and had come up with the iPad, it would have failed. Clive Sinclair failed with the C5, and now electric cars are very popular. So you've got to match change to what the organisation will bear. There has to be a link there. Although there's lots of talk of massive innovations and great spectacular change, there is a limit to what humans will bear, and that limit, I think, is shown to you by the culture of the organisation you're in, which is why it's so important to understand that culture. For us in the Air Force, I'll come to it later, we're running a change programme at the moment called Astra, a change initiative, I should say, and it's a big empowerment programme. And that's difficult because we live in a hierarchy. So that definitely is stretching the bounds of what's organisationally acceptable to us.
Thank you, Ian. So there's a lot that you've said in your definition there. So just perhaps if I may just highlight a couple of the things that you've mentioned. So in terms of your perspective on culture, cloud is an interesting way of describing it. So there's elements of it which are visible and open and seen, but actually quite a lot of it, I suspect you feel equally as important as the part that is unseen. You made it quite striking. You said the things that people do when you're not watching is kind of one of the indicators of that. And that culture has a degree of strength and resilience to it, which means that change has to be done in very much in the context of understanding that culture. You can't just sort of add things to it without knowing what really the culture is about. And RAF is in a particular case with the Astra project, and you mentioned empowerment. So sort of joining those together, then, Ian. So perhaps you could characterise what for you is the heart of this change project, this cultural change project that the RAF has embarked on now. And you mentioned, I think, empowerment. Is that part of the Astra project?
Yeah, it is, absolutely. Let me just dial back on that and say, why do we even need to do this? Because that's really important. Because you do risk the latest leadership, the latest fads, the latest management techniques, the latest words, and I'm a great believer in there not being that much new in the world. So for us, I mean, why do you have to do organisational change in the first place? I think it's a mix of internal and external factors. So internally, you might be failing, for example. That will be a good reason to do change. And externally, the competition, and of course for us, the competition is an interesting term, might be risking getting ahead of you, and therefore you lose your competitive edge. So anyway, internal versus external. For Astra, which is this initiative to take the Air Force through to 2040, it's two-pronged. It's a short-term change programme, which I'll talk about in a moment, but it also is a big long-term vision. What is an Air Force, an Air and Space Force like in 2040? What does the world where have we gone to in that time? And in the midst of the fourth industrial revolution, we can see that not only can we not predict the future, but the future is happening quicker than we first thought. So firstly, then, why do we do it? Well, I've just said the fourth industrial revolution, the confluence of robotics, AI, miniaturization, additive printing starts when you bring those together. And this is what revolutions are all about. You bring a number of different things together. They're fundamentally changing the calculus in so many ways that we have to get to it, because we are in a competitive environment. We hold the competitive edge, but we don't own the competitive edge. So we've got to keep it. We've also got new domains, and they're not that new, but in terms of warfighting in them, they are. Space and cyber are fast evolving, particularly in space, which has moved from a sort of the joking, the last frontier, to very much an operational and a warfighting environment where satellites are maneuvering around each other and are doing things to each other in space, and it's becoming ever more like an extension of the atmosphere. So for an organization to move into a new domain like space, whilst adopting new technologies from the fourth industrial revolution and becoming more cyber savvy, those are massive changes for us. And also we've got a workforce that's growing up in this era. Generation AA, when it comes to join the Air Force, have different expectations. I joined the Air Force as a career for life, and it was expected that when you leave, you never look back. Well, we're encouraging people now to think differently. We're encouraging the blurring of the edges between industry and the military. And in this era, the youth have the power. The youth have the knowledge. They are more tech savvy than everyone else, and they can drive change in our organization. But as I mentioned earlier, we're a hierarchy. We're a military hierarchy. So if we wind back 50 years, a junior person wasn't really allowed to talk to a senior person. Whereas in the modern age, now and beyond, we need our juniors to be teaching and in some cases leading our seniors. Those are all big topics on their own. So when you put them together, that's why we need Astra.
There are some very clear drivers to change. So the massive external change going on, and actually the workforce itself that's coming in is also demanding of that change, isn't it? So it's almost like an inversion of the hierarchy that you're envisaging there, where the people at the lower ends of the hierarchy become suddenly much more important because of their tech savviness, their understanding of some of these large changes that are occurring. Is that sort of how those two changes are coming together?
Yes, I've always been a believer that hierarchy exists to facilitate and enable those in the organisation who are at the coalface, if you like, the surgeons at the operating table. And so for me, this is a very exciting time, and I've got some experience in this, in doing this in the past, right. And it's so rewarding, so exciting. The challenge we face, though, is right there in culture. So I get emails from brilliant people of the Royal Air Force that start with, "Sorry for contacting you direct, but here's a brilliant idea." And it's like, why do people apologise for it? I say it's like Santa Claus apologising for coming down the chimney with all your Christmas presents. So those. We must look at the hierarchy as there to facilitate the organisation to do better, not to exist for its own right. And to do that, we've got to have better conversations at all levels in our force. And we've got to accept that some people will find this journey very, very difficult, especially those who've perhaps worked for a little bit of power and are now seeing it slip between their fingers as we invert that pyramid.
And Ian, so you mentioned that you got some experience of this from your own career. So as we get to almost like the heart of our topic, which is leading the change that you're describing. So what are the main sort of tactics, techniques that you have seen that leaders can deploy? Because as you describe culture itself, it's not the most obvious thing that you can change, is it? Because a lot of it is intangible. So what are the things that you can deploy? Perhaps maybe with an example that you've used yourself. It's a very exciting opportunity that you've described.
Yeah. So firstly, I think recognizing I've never seen perfect. I've seen very good, but I've never seen perfect. So I think the first thing is, as we enter into this, there's that oft-trotted stat that 80% of change programs fail. Well, of course, they don't fail to improve, but perhaps they fail to meet all of their metrics. So being kind to ourselves as we go through it's important. But in terms of things that I've seen work very well, and I'm not saying we're deploying all of these in Astra, we're trying our best to, but it's not necessarily an entire success story. Well, firstly is a clear vision of where we want to go. You've then got to have not just buy-in, you've got to have ownership and commitment from the top team, and if there is a top person, from the top person, and that's a personal thing that has to be demonstrated. There's a Charles Handy quote about this that says, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Well, if that's true, for me, the next part, behavior, is porridge, bacon and toast of this. Because I'm a firm believer that you've just got to get on and start changing. And big bureaucratic organizations, like a military or anywhere else that's big, is desperate to sit back and write policy and study it for a long time. And I'm the opposite. I think you should get in and start making your change at the earliest point possible. And as soon as that grows, you're looking to get into the virtuous circle as quickly as possible. And the virtuous circle, in Lean, I've heard it used as the show home. And that is demonstrating that there's a good reason to change, and there are clear benefits linked to the behaviors and the outcomes that are along that journey. So creating that show home and getting into the virtuous circle where things get better and better. If we've time, I can go into an example of that from previous times. And I think
Ian, actually, I think because it really does bring to life some of the concepts that you've mentioned. If you have an example of where you've seen that put into practice.
Yes, the virtuous circle. I'm going back a little bit now to a time when I was a squadron commander on a tornado squadron, and through a sustained period, and this is important too, two bosses of the squadron, but some of the other command team remaining in place. The unit at the time was described in very poor terms, very uncomplimentary terms, and objectively, the output of the unit was well below, it was the bottom of the grade. So the challenge here was to turn it around, and I really recommend. I think it's your ship and turn the ship around, because I read those afterwards and thought, oh wow, I missed a trick here, because this is perfect. Yeah. We wanted to go from the bottom to the top, and how do we get there? Well, we laid out a vision that talked about how we would change our unit, how we would ingest a little bit of Rudy Giuliani was the mayor of New York at the time, his broken windows philosophy. We fix everything. We do not tolerate what's not good enough. We aim to be the best, which was inconceivable when you're at the bottom of the league table. And we do it via using Lean, which was popular around at the time, but a lot of frontline units were turning their noses up at it, because how can that possibly work here, because it's Japanese car manufacturing. And we did. We had to part company with some people who fundamentally could not adjust, and we invested a lot in powerful people on the squadron, and that was anybody at any rank who understands this, might be a cynic and might be an advocate, but had an audience, could communicate. And then we just started demonstrating how we could, through adopting these different approaches to our work, make a 30-year-old aeroplane fantastically reliable, have shorter working hours, take more leave, and get more done. And this story ends. The show home, by the way, was reducing the working hours, because the night shift was a full 12-hour shift. And so we just started biting away at that time. Then we bit away at aircraft serviceability, and very quickly people cross over a line and they believe, and now you're either on or you're off. And the story ends. I'll draw a line in Afghanistan where we flew 409 consecutive sorties on a 30-year-old fast jet without break, on a squadron where every single person took all of their leave. There were no service complaints or any discipline issues outstanding, and it was routine to have all the jets serviceable every day. And by serviceable, I mean actually serviceable, not pretend serviceable. So it was a very, very important time in my life going through that period, because it was actually quite a short period. And it told me as well that culture change, people tend to talk in terms of 5 years. I think this is why behavior drives culture, drives strategy. Because if you start to behave differently, I think in organisations that are highly adaptable, and the Air Force is one of those, you can accelerate elements of that culture change. And for me, I think, and looking at Astra, the trick is to embed enough of it quick enough that you can't go back. That's always the challenge, because organisations generally are what I call spring-loaded to zero. They love to just go back how things were before. Yeah. And how do you make sure that the new zero is a different place from the old zero?
It's an interesting idea called unlearning. In fact, organisations can unlearn as well as learn. I think you just mentioned that idea. So that's a fascinating example. And just from what you were just saying at the end there, so thinking now about from the Air Force's perspective, you feel that this was a substantial piece of the Iris operation that you turned around in the way that you described. You think that can be applied to the Air Force more generally? That's obviously part of your current vision, is that right?
Yeah, I really do. And I just dial back on that sentence. So I might have been the officer commanding of the squadron, but I didn't turn it around. Right. It was my predecessor, it was my senior engineer, it was my warrant officer engineer, and it was the people on the squadron who did that. I had to play my part. And I think for me, Astra is exactly in the same place. There is no way that a single person can do this. And actually, there's no way that a single group can do this. We might build ink spots around the organisation. But what's really important is that people around the whole organisation identify with enough of Astra to realise that it's a question, not an answer. And the question is, what will you do? And the way that we've built in taking this message to people is a network of ambassadors in all professions, all ranks, all locations, because a lot of the Air Force aren't on Air Force bases, actually. Yeah. They're in other organisations. So we've got about 700 now, which is a large number. We've got a great comms network where we can dial up the whole network very quickly. They've got access to me and people like me. But importantly, organisations can be quite cynical of change because there's plenty of it around. And of course, some people say, I wish all this change would stop. The world just isn't like that. If you don't evolve, you do die. And in our case, I mean that quite literally. So for me, the key is getting enough of the message out there, getting enough culture change. And I'm seeing it already where emails to people like me don't start with sorry for contacting you, but we've already seen some of our greatest ideas for changing the now on the way to the future are Kickstarter ideas, and we've got some Kickstarter funding, importantly, that helps fuel that from anyone. Anyone in the Air Force can now write a short business case and apply for Kickstarter funding and change it. But of course, it's not really about money. Money, in many ways, I think, is the least of our concerns, although people think it's the top one. This is about how things are done around here. Yeah. This is about how junior people are empowered at a very local level to make a change, and how we short circuit the very hierarchy that serves us very well in some certain combat scenarios. Work in progress.
Absolutely. Something you mentioned a couple of times there, and it's almost as if you feel that there's a point that you can recognise as a leader. I mean, you've heard the jargon tipping point, right? There's a sort of point which I think you described in the change that you were involved in and part of and participating in. That you kind of recognise where things suddenly shift from one stage to another stage. Is that
definitely
right? Could I just ask you to highlight that a bit more? Is that something you can actually look for and recognise as a leader?
Yeah, I think it really is. In warfare, we call it the campaign fulcrum, and for me, it is like a seesaw that tips. It is a tipping point because it's the point for me where the change becomes self-sustaining. And you start seeing things emerge that you had no idea were happening, and yet you know that they are right. And I suppose in another way, in a way that you can't really measure, you work out that more people are now with the change than against it. So measuring that is very, very important. I think there are, again, the military, we use a term combat indicators. I think some of those are when people stop talking about the change initiative itself and just talk about what they're doing, and their behaviours and actions are entirely compatible with that change initiative.
So it's
those are sorts of things you can look for. Exactly that, yeah.
Right. And you mentioned people talk about it. It's almost capturing those narratives and stories, isn't it, that for you reflect the kind of organisation you want to be. That's presumably quite an important part of recognising whether the culture has made that shift, the stories that people tell about it, the sort of way they describe it. Is that
it really is. It really is, Craig. So we're being very careful at the moment. Although there's quite a lot of good reason to make our Astra initiative a public story, we're actually, the vast majority of our effort is on an internal communications, because we're at the early phase, we're at the boost phase, and this is a long-term initiative. And capturing those stories, I mean, we recently did one that demonstrated how we could quickly improve the lot of people on stations. It was relatively straightforward. It was, this is how you get Amazon to locate Amazon lockers on stations and get your goods delivered to Amazon lockers close to you, as opposed to going through the military postal service, which clogs up the military postal service, takes longer, and is more limited into when you can pick your things up. So not many people in life have set up Amazon lockers, because it doesn't happen. So we created a system in this called the Flat Pack, which basically puts it all together on a silver platter and says, here's what you've got to think about. here's the interaction with the infrastructure people. Here's the power requirements. Here's the security elements of it. There's where the sort of place it's got to go. Here's who you've got to speak to. Off you go. And those stories, I mean, that came about, that was a junior rank who came up with that. Didn't cost any money to do, and would have been a good idea at one station, but now is out there everywhere, and we're backing it. And it's quite a banal example, but really making sure that we celebrate those successes and failures in the early days is all part of writing the legend, the story that will become our Astra Next Generation Air Force.
The URF, the Next Generation RF. Yeah, no, that is fantastic. And as ever, we're unfortunately up against our time. So perhaps I could just ask you to finish by perhaps a message to some of the leaders in the RF, and perhaps actually not just the leaders, but all ranks in the RF actually, where when you say, here is the one or two things that I would really want you to think about as we embark on this long stage change in Astra. What would those one or two key messages be from you, would you say?
Yeah, so for anyone doing change, of course, we're all leaders. It's completely irrespective of rank or role. We all have a leadership role, we all have a followership role, and we play those roles throughout our lives. So that's all of us. But if you are leading a change, I would go back to start with why. Have a clear idea of where you're going, and that means you've got to understand where you're starting from. Try to express those goals and be consistent about them, clear and consistent throughout. Get personal skin in the game, and I'm talking about get your own skin in the game and get as many other people's skin in the game as possible, because that really changes the needle here. And the last one I'd say is persevere and be kind to yourself, because if you shoot for the stars and you make it to the moon, you've still made it to the moon. And this is tough. Change is tough, and cultural change, I think, is the toughest of the tough. So there will be setbacks. You won't go as fast as you want to go. People will say unkind things, and other people will simply not get behind it. This is the stuff of life. It's part of the journey.
Right. Ian, fantastic. And that's perhaps an excellent note for us to finish our conversation on. So Ian Gale, Vice-Marshal Gale, remains for me to thank you on behalf of the Tedder Academy, University of Lincoln, for your contribution to this fascinating subject. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Craig. I really enjoyed it today.
My pleasure.